Welcome to the first session today. My name is Aneesh. I usually don't tell my full name because it's slightly ridiculous. It's Aneesh. It's repeated twice. Even Butros Ghali at least had a Ghali there. I don't. I am an associate professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I have been writing about algorithm, or what I call algocracy, the rule of the algorithm, for quite some time. In 2000, I was doing some research on this, on global software development. And I was curious going between, I was looking at this regime, labor regime between India. First of all, let me put a little, my slides are not working, so it's going to be a little more theoretical talk, which I was planning anyway. So, and it might be, other people have a lot of nice visuals. So global software development could happen, because I was kind of organizational sociologist, and I was like, who's organizing? Where's the middle manager in these global software teams sitting in Beijing, on Arlington Heights here, in Bangalore, India, or Gurgaon, India, in different places, and working on the same project? Who's organizing this? And then I realized it's the code, it's the algorithm that's the organizing mechanism. So the software code itself became the middle managerial layer. So from there, then I developed the idea of algocracy, rule of the algorithm, as opposed to the rule of the bureau, which rule of the office that Weber talks about, or rule of the gaze that Foucault talks about. Because rule of the algorithm is quite different from the other two, and I probably shouldn't go into detail because we have a lot of panelists here. Then second project was on India's call centers, and what struck me was that when we hear these telemarketing calls, people calling from India to Canada, Australia, US, England, this kind of global conversation that happened. For the global conversation to happen, identities have to be slightly tweaked and shifted and changed. So Indian call center workers, of course, have to adopt pseudonyms, that make their Western clientele a little more comfortable with their identity. But in addition to that, there's a lot of training that goes on in terms of accent training, what they call neutralization of the accent. And my book on titled Neutral Accent is coming out this spring. But what was curious, so one could think in terms of pure kind of Western hegemony that, look at these poor Indian call center workers, they have to change their identity. They have to change so much. They have to adopt new gestures, conversational gestures to talk with others. They have to kind of erase or at least mitigate some of the kind of the thickness of, the cultural thickness that comes from living in different parts of India, having, because of primary socialization. So, but one thing curious that occurred to me when I realized that for this global talk to happen, the customer has to change too. But you cannot change the customer. We are living in the US, or Canada. We don't go through training to talk to a call center agent. So, but my premise was that something has to neutralize the difference, both cultural difference, regional difference, geographic distance, immense spatial gulf has to somehow be overcome. And then I realized again, algorithm came back to the picture, which is I realized that the call center worker was not dialing the phone. It's the automatic software called the dialer that dialed the phone, and it dialed according to the certain profile. So suppose a telemarketer is trying to sell kind of a mortgage loan. It's not the way it connects with customer relations databases is that algorithm doesn't allow for the dialer to dial, let's say, a 7-year-old, 15-year-old child, or a 20-year-old guy, or an 80-year-old person. So it profiles automatically, Then I started realizing that the two parties in this conversation were engaged in a sort of post-social conversation, in the sense that there was no social need to reach an understanding that was guiding this conversation. Actually, they were put together and they found themselves unwittingly talking with each other by this algocratic regime. And then I have to keep this time in mind. Okay. Then I realized then theoretically we have to think through this idea of what an identity is. And if you look at the earlier 20th century literature on social, how identity formation occurs, people like pragmatists like George Herbert Mead, they never thought that there was really an identity. There was no hermetically sealed self that one could access. It was self was always a dynamic process in the process of always becoming. But the interesting thing, shift that occurs in this understanding of identity is that if you go back, the way we think of social identity, and here in this talk, I'm going to present 3 different sets of identity and how digital technologies are constructing and creating what I call system identity. So from social identity, bureaucratic identity, then we move to system identity. And social identity, if you go back to, let's say, the anthropological writings, where you go, live with the natives, that construction of identity was bound to the place. And I don't have my slides, so I could show that people were sometimes deriving their last names from after the name of the place, right? So let's say Saddam Hussein's, partner or in crime was Tikriti. His last name was Tikriti, Barzanal Tikriti, and Tikriti is a village in Iraq, right? Same with in India and a lot of places. You take the last name from your place. So then the other part of social identity was bound to kinship networks, right? Face-to-face conversation. So when you scale up that kind of small-scale community of village-based kinship and place-bound networks, and scale it up to the national territorials, to the nation state, the territorial scale of the nation state, then you are bound to imagine community. So Benedict Anderson comes out with the idea of imagined community, except that he doesn't point that at that level, there is no other way except to imagine, because you cannot know 300 million people, 100 million people, or 5 million people face to face, as you would do in a kind of. So the new sort of identity, and which James Scott and other people have talked about, kind of bureaucratic identity emerges. The state wanted, at some point of time, John Torpy, etc., have pointed out, the monopoly over the legitimate means of not just violence, but movement as well. So James Scott kind of charts Seeing Like a State, the sedentarization of populations by the state, right? So people started, census the population, their residence, even permanent last names were the product of the modern state. And in modern times, we also see the driver's licenses, passports, hundreds of different kinds of ID cards that we swipe through, or various different kinds of organizations. That's bureaucratic identity. But bureaucratic identity is focused on the ascriptive character of the person. So whether it's fingerprints, ascriptive in the sense that it wants to find out that through all these dynamic changes, the person has remained the same. The person, Aneesh, who's traveling on their passport today is the same guy who traveled 10 years ago on the same passport, right? So the idea is a kind of fixity, which is the kind of bureaucratic idea of membership in an organization. But system identity in call centers are based on a certain transfer or certain transition from what we can call a transition from cosmology to technology, right? And here we can kind of go a little bit more theoretically, understand what the system identity means. And I'll just give you examples first before I go into theory. So system identity is not a fixed identity. It catches us in our dynamism in everyday change. So your FICO scores, for your financial identity, for example, is not static. It's changing with your behavior every year, every month. Your medical identity is changing with your body. So different sorts of your legal identity, criminal identity, all sorts of modern system identities that we are looking at, they are contingent on the emergent behavior. So there's a movement from the idea of substance, which was old social identity was formed, where nature was naturalized and identity was naturalized, so much that the person would become would adopt the last name of the village itself. That itself was a construction too, but it was a construction of a different sort. It was making things permanent, making the person and one's identity in the form of a substance. So now, if we move out of substance to the idea of emergence, then there is no substrate on which you can lay over new identity. So various system identities and their proliferation in modern times with the big data is astounding. We know that, you know, in LAPD is doing an experiment with trying to catch the criminals before they commit a crime by creating certain algorithms and analysis of behavior. So it's not necessarily even based on the individual. It's where the individual profile fits in the pattern of larger social data that's being produced constantly. So as we say, our digital droppings are culled. The difference of system identity lies from both social and bureaucratic is that it's not only dynamic and not only changing, it doesn't have any substance. It doesn't have any platform on which it's being created. So algorithms could be written about around the big data for all sorts of reasons, all sorts of purposes. One cannot pin it down to either some bureaucratic reason of membership. And that's why I kind of think of, and most of the kind of data double kind of literature that has emerged within the paradigm of surveillance studies, which is fantastic. It has done great work. But we might need to move out of still privileging the individual whose data double we are talking about. System identity in that sense is beyond the individual. It takes the irritations from our behavioral droppings of data here and there. It takes those irritations and constructs an entirely different reality to which we don't have any access to. Unlike bureaucratic or social identity, we don't know how our FICO scores are created behind our back. We don't, you can register your protest that your FICO score has been lowered for wrong reasons. I did not default on that loan. We can start protesting, and mechanisms could be there. But there is no direct relationship with the data. We don't even know where the data lies and who's using it and who's constructing for what purposes. Our shopping identity is a consumer identity. We don't know our traveling identity, residential. It's an identity, and that's where theoretically, once we start thinking that these identities compared to the previous forms of constructions are not constructions by us or by the individual, but they are constructions by various systems of observation. And that's where the transfer from cosmology to technology, which people like Foucault and Deleuze have talked about, where life used to happen outside history, as Foucault would say, before biopower. And with biopower transition, life is folded into history. So in some ways, he's extending quite a bit Heideggerian notion of technology as enframing, where technology adapts to its own reserve. It constructs the world as a standing reserve and then adapts itself to its own results by challenging that standing reserve, and the answers come back in a particular way. So same way, these systems of observations are challenging this data, and they are constructing certain responses are provided by the data to these systems of observation, and they create there's a kind of recursivity. So instead of cosmology where life happens outside decision, so if you go back to diseases, or rain. So if you go to 200 years ago in many villages, you would see that people are praying the god. So praying God for the drought, to have some rain. But that was considered outside human decision making. But with the shift to technology, everything happens within the discourse of risk. So all outcomes are considered products of human decisions themselves. And then human decisions have to constantly play with that contingency, which is there's nothing fixed. So the notion of system identity is both abstract, both it's contingent, it's primary to our identity. It focuses before we become that. It could focus even on the data provided by the past behavior about our future predictive behavior, quite like Google algorithms can do. They predict when we search, as Shiva Vaidyanathan has pointed out, Google is not in search business, they're in the prediction business. Before you start typing, they know what you're going to type after the first letter. So the idea of system identity, I think, is to allow a notion of identity which is not based necessarily in an individual human being as a kind of totality, but rather is a contingent event among a lot of other events. I think I'll stop there.
All right, so I'm Jathan Sadowski. I'm a PhD student in the Human and Social Dimensions of Science and Technology, which is just a much longer way of saying Science and Technology Studies at Arizona State University. And my talk is From Mega Machines to Mega Algorithms. So in the middle of last century, the historian Lewis Mumford had a catchy term, the mega machine, he used to describe a historically prevalent form of organization that functions like a massive mechanical system, but with humans in the place of cogs. These mega machines, such as bureaucracies that we can trace back to ancient Egypt, but rapidly spread and developed in the Industrial Revolution, are essentially technologies of information processing, with their managerial hierarchies, divisions of labor, and intricate methods of accounting. Mega machines excel at controlling large social systems and coordinating collective actions for the purpose of achieving some goal. And while they are composed of humans, mega machines are fundamentally anti-human, often in both their means and ends. The human cogs are just one organic component, likely with little knowledge, let alone possessing a real choice, of how their actions would be incorporated into the functioning of the whole system. They are thus treated like automatons, made to do rote, soulless work and squeezed for value. And the ends of the mega machine can be truly terrible. For instance, ensuring an extractive corporate behemoth continues to grow and prosper, or keeping the government war machine running smoothly. There's a reason why Mumford used the Kremlin and the Pentagon as prime examples of the mega machine. The mega machine is the forerunner, I think, for where we are now. Mumford's insights are still relevant, but in need of some updating. In the time of network computing and smart technologies and digital platforms, what I call the mega algorithm is taking over, with people acting as information nodes, inputs, and outputs. Rather than human cogs, we have human nodes. So I couldn't help but put this image up here, mostly because I pulled it from the Russian government's open data site from an article. But I think it's more than just like a funny relic of an image. From a business textbook or something like that. I think it's loosely representative graphic. So I mean, in a sense, with the mega machine, people are atomized by digital technologies and blown apart into streams of data. With their identities and actions, every share, click, and comment, every piece of content generated, fed into processors. People provide productive labor, mediated and processed by layers of code, and are incorporated into the mega algorithm simply by existing on the network. The logic of the system is to create, collect, and extract value from the human nodes however possible. With the mega algorithm, like with the mega machine, we are subsumed into feedback-driven information processing systems in which the human is incidental but also essential. The mega algorithm assimilates functions once assigned to people and assigns them the code that becomes one or many steps removed from its programmer. Yet the system can't run without people who act as the nodes in the network. So there's a large stable of commentators, both critics and boosters, who make a good living proclaiming that in our digital age, everything is different than it was before and nothing will ever be the same. However, as Astra Taylor writes in her new book, The People's Platform, many of the problems that plagued our media system before the internet was widely adopted have carried over into the digital domain. Consolidation, centralization, and commercialism, and will continue to shape it. So we haven't escaped history, nor have we jumped into a totally different epoch or society. Rather than a radical shift towards a new political economy, these technologies both allow for and encourage a further intensification of the ability to monitor, monetize, and manipulate people. And the techno-utopic discourses of emancipation and community that surround them serve as a highly effective ideological veil, which shrouds the practices of exploitation and control. So consider the following juxtaposition. On one hand, Google uses already available human translations to provide the huge set of linguistic data needed to fuel their own translation service. Google's data mining strategy primarily relies on two giant sources, translations of Harry Potter novels and United Nations documents, which they can then usefully and cheaply process for their algorithm. Now imagine if the translators kept their copyright and could negotiate for kickbacks on the income that Google receives. After all, those translators performed a labor-intensive service which Google then appropriated. But inegalitarian capitalism has convenient amnesia. When we're all data streams, somehow the ability to get paid for what we produce disappears, when it could actually be stronger. On the other hand, Coursera, a for-profit online education startup, is also in need of translators' labor so it can sell MOOCs in other languages. So back in April, they created the Global Translator Community. Rather than pay for services, which is such a passé notion now, Coursera has another plan. By using rhetoric of community and solidarity, they are actively recruiting volunteers to contribute to their crowd translating project. While no money exchanges hands, these volunteers must sign a translator's agreement to ensure that all ownership of produced services transfers to Coursera. In an article about Coursera's project in Jacobin, Jeff Schollenberger coined the term voluntariat to describe these volunteer laborers. The voluntariat, he writes, performs skilled work that might still command a wage without compensation, allegedly for the sake of the public good, regardless of the fact that it also contributes directly and unambiguously to the profitability of a corporation. So unlike the UN documents, which Google appropriated from existing stocks of data, the labor by the volunteer translators is done with the express purpose of creating value for Coursera. Sure, those voluntariat must derive some fulfillment from this labor, which blurs and collapses the distinction between the spheres of play and labor, or else they wouldn't spend free time doing it. But whether or not they are aware of the insidious implications of de-skilled and disempowered labor is another question. It's obvious, though, who really benefits, who gets to drink deeply from the data streams, and Google and Coursera want to keep it that way. But at the same time, there lately seems to be a number of new platforms popping up and promising liberational alternatives to existing services. Take the social media platform Bubbaloo, which explicitly tries to subvert the economics that drives the likes of Facebook by redirecting money to users. They pay a penny per click, per comment, and per like on a user's post. Bubbaloo pays out in $50 batches, so to earn their first paycheck, users have to rack up 5,000 likes, comments, and/or clicks. One of the company's founders told Fast Coexist, quote, "We started the company because we were reading about how a lot of the social media networks out there were creating the world's largest unpaid workforces, and we said we could make that different." Now, it's not hard to draw some connections between Bubbaloo and the political art project / thought experiment known as Wages for Facebook. Though whereas Wages for Facebook takes the activist route and politicizes the digital labor we perform on and for these platforms, Bubbaloo takes the entrepreneur's path and just promises to cut us in on the profits. Ultimately, however, these different digital platforms are all founded on very similar ideas of how technology fits into political economy. Be it the users as products of Facebook, the users as shareholders of Bubbaloo, or the voluntariat labor of Coursera. They allow private for-profit corporations to circumvent the need to pay for valuable labor, thus padding their own bottom line while leaving workers out. even to the point of hiding or obscuring much of the actual human labor involved in their business operations, making it seem like these algorithms and these platforms just kind of work in a mystical or magical way, which in turn further contributes to a large-scale reshaping of the economics of labor. That is, paying people for the goods and services they produce stops being part of the way business is done, and thus finding jobs that come with security, longevity, and a paycheck becomes an even more precarious task. So stock photos like these are of course cheesy and overdone, but I think they reveal something about the way that businesses view the workforce of tomorrow as the bottom image. That's the name on the JPEG, the workforce of tomorrow. But it reveals the way that people kind of just fade into the bright digital network and become subsumed into it. They just become part of it. Because unlike with the mega machine, it's not always clear when we've been assimilated as a human node in the mega algorithm. The systems are now so interrelated, entangled so tightly, so subtly, so constantly, that it appears there's no escape. It functions as what can be understood in Deleuzian terms as a rhizome. Like the roots and shoots of a persistent, massive set of plants, it seems to pop up everywhere. And it seems capable of ultimate flexibility, able to derive value from people in ways that are not obviously exploitative or controlling. I think this is one of the largest problems facing activism and critique alike. I mean, how do you fight against a logic or a system that, one, on a case-by-case basis, doesn't seem like that big of a deal? I mean, hell, we gain a lot of immediate benefits from these services, a wide range of immediate benefits. And what are the powerful rallying points of harm and indignation to even motivate action in the first place? And two, the system is dispersed and pervasive. That is, there's not a clear center mass to aim for. Instead, it can feel like stabbing at a dense fog of abstract foes. Now, to be sure, we shouldn't just throw our hands up in the air and parrot the common slogan, that's just the way the internet or social media or digital networks work. The current political economic structures don't necessarily have to be the case. They aren't determined in that way. But it's telling when the radical solutions we're presented with, like bubaloos, are still premised on commodification and capital accumulation. I mean, just look at the plan described in Jaron Lanier's latest book. The very idea that now our social life must constantly be framed in terms of monetization is, to be frank, despicable and reductive, serving to further entrench the logics that we should be abandoning. It's not uncommon to hear amongst people like us at this conference that the internet can be used for more than selling ourselves. Yet our collective techno-political imagination can't seem to come up with much in the way of socially just and actionable alternatives, ways of designing and implementing digital platforms that escape these kinds of logics. I refuse to believe that the best we can do is sit back and wait for the likes of Facebook or Coursera or some other technology corporation to become enlightened and bring about radical change. If that's our best option, then I think we better get comfortable tilling those data fields, producing content for platforms, and playing our role in the mega algorithm. Now, I wish I could stand up here and end by laying out the blueprints of a master plan, but even if I did, I don't think it would be that good. Instead, I'll just wrap up by insisting that we not forget that the mega machine is still alive and well. It's just transformed into something perhaps even more insidious, something more pervasive and more sneaky in many ways. And without really understanding the lineage and the characteristics of the mega algorithm or any other moniker you want to use to describe this logic, I think that we risk continuing to hack away at the heads of a hydra that barely feels any of the pain we try to inflict on it. I know one thing, though. Whatever way forward we carve out, the solidarity and union amongst activists, artists, academics, organizers, laborers, like the kind that this conference is really trying to encourage and create, is crucial for deconstructing the systems we're targeting, both in terms of analysis and in more literal ways of deconstruction. Thank you.
I'm Orit Halpern. For design school, this is like really badly organized. Just exactly. Anyway, so I'm not giving the paper that was originally signed up for because a little contingency is always a good thing. I thought there were some changes in this panel. But I'm a historian here. I'm also in culture and media and at the design studies program at Parsons. And I work a lot on algorithms and big data. And but I'm also really interested in this talk, particularly about the sort of architectures. I think this will speak closely to Aneesh's piece about sort of architectures of dividuation, about actually how perception and sensation have come to be monetized and sort of some of the implications for that. And of course, algorithms sit beneath all of this, and you can also ask me a little bit more about the relationships between what you're going to see today and some other systems that I often write about, primarily cybernetics, the rise of finance, behaviorism, stuff like that. Anyway, so just to start, demo or die, the famous words of MIT Media Lab founder Nicholas Negroponte. And these words gesture to a feature at the heart of my talk, which is the relationship between computer immersive environments and biopolitics, even survival. And I want to ask how our perceptual field came to be monetizable and how we architect environments, in fact, to allow kind of particular relationships, right, and transformations in subjectivity in relationship to media. And just to kind of begin, this is Songdo in South Korea. It's considered a kind of test bed for the future. I can't wait to live there. It's considered a prototype or test bed, and its claim to fame is that it's a smart, or in the Korean parlance, ubiquitous city. And it's part of a new global infrastructure of spaces, and I'm working currently on these complexes that range from India to Ecuador to Nigeria. And they all have that kind of neat glass thing, and you can see the algorithm literally at work in computer-aided design. And I'm sure they could roll 10 other ones and they'd all look the same. And all the marking, what's interesting is how this ubiquitous computing, and also just a few other words about them. So this is Songdo again that I work in. It's part of a global business utopia, Inchin, yes. It's actually the first, one of the first special economic zones after the post-war period. It was first established already after the Korean War by the Americans. Incheon is where the landing came. And of course, these kind of fancy, this is really, these kind of fancy developments sort of are usually part of another infrastructure. So part of the Incheon Free Zone is a port and an airport. This is one of the largest automated port facilities in East Asia. And so this is sort of the supply chain, also ubiquitously and pervasively computationally managed. That's sort of the background of these areas for which these kind of fancy developments are sort of the interface, if you will, too. And in all the marketing, what I find really interesting for these things is the way that ubiquitous computing has come to be linked to economic growth and to the sustainability of life itself. So there's a discourse of green, right, around all this smartness. And so there's a temporality to these spaces, therefore it's both speculative and one of preemption and preparedness for an apocalyptic future that is never defined but drives the relentless proliferation of computing and tech and capital into the environment. This assumption on the necessity of penetration of computation into the environment is currently virtually unquestioned in design or architecture fields. So even if you hate this smart city, you still really believe that things have to be responsive to be good. It's a kind of a virtue in design. Architecture fields is necessary, and that computing is necessary for environmental management and green construction. And I'm really interested in how this equation came to be. So how is it that bandwidth as rates of bits transferred between connections in a unit of time has come to equal sustainability, has come to equal life itself? I mean, there's nothing actually. And of course, we all know data centers waste tons of money and tons of energy. And anyway, there's no real way to substantiate this, but nonetheless, it's become, I think, a dominant ideology today. These are also geographies of, and then there's a series of other little sub-equations that I like to talk about today, which is most of this smartness is about sensors, and we talked about the police sensors that are being laid up. You probably may have noticed your poles being changed in New York City, but obviously your cell phones, everything. So how has sensing come to equal smartness? Smartness is sort of the equivalent of this sort of network stupidity, which is a lot of little agents without consciousness can build, just kind of autopoietically build these really smart things. And then, so how does stupidity come to equal sensing, come to equal new forms of population that are now being equated as value? Why? Because, of course, the idea here, oh, sorry, I'm having some problems figuring out. But the idea behind these things, right, is that you won't have taxes. They're going to monetize the data being generated by these populations, and that's the actual business plan. So, fabulous. And these are also geographies, right, of sensation and perception, and especially in East Asia, it's just almost impossible to get away from the number of LED screens and things everywhere. And most of my work is concerned with this political economy of the senses. And what makes these cities smart, of course, as I mentioned, is the vast amount of data they collect and, in theory, monetize from the environment and the populations that inhabit them. And this is the control room in Songdo. They were just demoing it last September when I was there. And it's kind of the world as an interface. And what's astounding, and there's environmental data there, there's traffic data, there's all sorts of surveillance from a number of different systems that are operating simultaneously. But what's really interesting is these monitors serve no immediate functional purpose for the human body or human eyes whatsoever, except for aesthetic. The engineers and administrators cannot apprehend or act immediately on these images. So all that traffic data, this is a standard IBM operating center, and all the traffic data and stuff is being monitored automatically through algorithms. And it's actually too much data for any human being to actually be able to act on or immediately perform on. So no one can actually act on these images. Rather, all this traffic, environmental, and CCTV data is being autonomously analyzed, as I said, by IBM software platforms and algorithms. So this is a purely performative architecture, and then the question is, what is it doing? And I open with this scene because it prompts serious questions about the work of simulation, what constitutes vision and even seeing in our present, its relationship to life, both of species and subjects. And so one place to rethink the inevitability of this contemporary condition, right, is through historical genealogy. And today, as a kind of small case study, I want to start with one of the more important precedents for places like Songdo. Arguably the first fully responsive environment, whatever, we don't want to give any origins, but arguably one of the ones we like to tout and herald back to the most was a system built by the Architecture Machine Group, ArcMac, later to become Media Lab at MIT, titled the Aspen Movie Map of 1978. It was built through a careful, and here's it working, and that's the head, and he's kind of wafting through Aspen. Built through a careful survey of Aspen, which is a fancy ski resort that I've never been to, but I'm there now. Done through gyro-stabilized cameras that took an image every foot traversed down the streets of Aspen, Colorado, is a system working through laser discs, a joystick, that would allow a user to traverse the space of Aspen at their leisure and speed. The film was shot both forward and backwards, so you could navigate in reverse, so there's a temporality to this system. You could also place objects in space in it, and also historical archival objects. They had all sorts of weird things that you could traverse here. There's also a scalar component. You can see the system through an abstract map at a distance. Before maybe you could see it, it'll flash back. So while simultaneously navigating within space, so there's kind of two scales, a kind of global scale and an immersive one simultaneously happening at once. And the effect Negroponte said was to have so much recorded that the experience was seamless. There are no computers to be seen. This is not a model. It is Aspen. As Michael Neimark, an artist who worked on the project, has written and who I've interviewed, he says, and I quote, "Aspen is a verb, not a place," end quote. It's a way to live. It's a way to be in the world. This is the world as interface. Originally, Originally, Aspen was commissioned by the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency of the U.S. Military Cybernetics Division. The military inspiration came from the stories of the Israeli use of a simulated environment to accomplish the mission of saving hijacked Israeli citizens at Entebbe in Uganda. Not to be outdone by those Israelis, DARPA thought to do one better and not just build a fake environment, but simulate one. Computers could do this better. The project, however, was not classified, and this feature recognizes another fact. Even as counterterrorism and urban warfare had become pressing issues by the 1960s with decolonization mandating new military strategies, there was also another war going on in the United States. The urban riots of the late 1960s, sparked by Martin Luther King's assassination, and increasing tensions as whites fled urban areas, erasing tax bases, and refusing to desegregate America's geography, economy, or politics, had prompted a new discourse of war and crisis in America's cities. At MIT, urban planners and designers had long turned away, even before the 1960s, from discourses of the social to those of cognitive computing and communication science. Environments came to be understood to emanate from interactions between agents and possessing an affective or cognitive character that's kind of captured in this map. Designers consuming these discourses increasingly, therefore, turned to personalization and interactivity as a solution to race warfare, and I'm going to kind of trace that. The result being the rise of this responsive environment as the centerpiece of architecture and urban design pedagogy. In turn, Aspen emerged as a solution, the supposedly first responsive environment, an individualized but networked way to negotiate space, a new form of life to answer perhaps the seeming ruins of modern urbanity, a simulation that would become life itself. This model is also, and I can't understress the importance of this model because it's often considered predecessor to many first shooter games, military simulations, both battlefield and PTSD treatment, and also Google Earth. The world was not, of course, always a demo. There's a prehistory to this responsive environment. In the early 1960s, the lab had begun with ideas of testing and simulation. At first, they wanted to make computers smart, but that didn't go very well with Minsky. So largely Negroponte attacks Minsky, says this isn't going to work. And they increasingly turn to figuring out how to make people more computer-like or fit with computers. And one of the first demos of how computers could aid urban design was an effort to engage African American communities in the then increasingly tense racialized urban environment of Boston. Negroponte argued his approach. So this is like a super demo. So basically they started running Turing tests on tenants in Boston's underprivileged neighborhood, the South End, asking them what they wanted from design and from neighborhood improvement. So basically these three African American men, you can see, and actually one of them, Negroponte, is very proud, has a tenant power button, are asking their questions about how they want their neighborhood, what they want from the politics and urban change and the planners, and they're asking to what they think is a computer, but actually it's a person. You can see this white man answering their questions at the lower right-hand corner, but like all things, it's a demo. It's to demonstrate that computers aren't good enough, but they're going to get there. And the power of this demo as kind of epistemology, of course, has been written about, and it's critical in kind of producing an imaginary for computing, and that's exactly what Negroponte said. And he argued, next, there will be a computer. This proves computers are better. And he says something vital here that is repeated at the time by many human scientists and engineers, and I highlight it because it's really central to my point. And that is, he starts by refiguring population, and he makes this stunning statement. The three user inhabitants said things to this machine they would probably not have said to another human, particularly a white planner or politician. To them, the machine was not black, was not white, and surely had no prejudices. Of course. Machines would monitor, what these machines would do is monitor the propensity for change of the body politic, end quote. And what will remove these machines from a brave new world is that they will be able to and must search for the exception in desire and need, the 1 in a million. In other words, when the generalization matches the local desire, are omnipresent, this is like 1970s, machines will not be excited. It is when the particular varies from the group preferences their machine will react, not to thwart it, but to service it. And I highlight this because it's a critical moment. What's key here in this discussion is how ideas of norms and individuals become about capacities and differences. This is a new form of planning that will have no preordained organization and constantly seeks to grow by consuming differences or varieties into the system. This is a model that assumes that many different agents making minute decisions can collectively produce an intelligent or smart environment without consciousness. And the idea of population as a cloud or a difference, in his words, a propensity for change. This automation of emergence itself is as the very site of technical investment and design concern. Its attendant biopolitics are, of course, one of the central themes I want to develop here. And then Negroponte goes on to say something else. He also says that in order to rethink population, we must rethink intelligence. So what is this smartness? And at the beginning of his famous book, The Architecture Machine, which introduces computer-aided design into many of the design architecture fields, he says something, and I quote it, "Computer-aided design cannot occur without machine intelligence. And that intelligence must be behavioral, and it must have a sophisticated set of sensors, effectors, and processors." So basically, if we take this statement seriously, then the history of computer-aided design is not based in architecture or planning, but rather in cybernetics. And particularly what he's referring to here is neural nets and the emerging cognitive sciences. And I do a lot of work on this. You can ask me more about these models. But essentially, this is a behavioral, sensorial, performative intelligence, not one that's in the realm of representation. So these forms of intelligence are embodied, affective, sensory, and behavioral. This is a material intelligence that can be extracted. Most importantly, this quote makes us realize, that what it is that in order to think responsive environments demanded a reformulation of both reason, what is to think, and sorry, I'm having like some problems directing my slides here. This is a material intelligence, and most importantly, this quote makes us recognize that to be able to think responsive environments demands a reformulation of both reason, what it is to think, and a reformulation of sensation to make the environment itself not an external factor to the subject, but itself a medium. Having reached, however, the limits of IRB protocols with people, the demos must go on. Negroponte and his team at ArcMac turned to a new frontier art and another micro-world titled Seek, in an exhibition done for the Jewish Museum's famous software exhibition in 1970. The exhibit consisted of a small group of Mongolian desert gerbils chosen according to Negroponte for their curiosity and inquisitive nature, and which were then placed in an environment of plexiglass blocks that would constantly be rearranged by a robotic arm. The basic concept was that the mechanism would observe the interactions of the gerbils and their habitat, the blocks, and would learn their living preferences by observing their behavior and how they moved the blocks around. The gerbils were there to introduce chance, according to the group, and non-mechanical behavior into the environment, the unpredictable. This machine, Negroponte argued in an interview, and I quote, was conceived as both a cybernetic world model and a, and I quote, behaviorist laboratory for observation and experimentation. And here you can see it actually set up in the museum. Can't wait to be there. Come on. Anyway, the experiment actually went quite badly. The computers for all the show constantly collapsed and fell apart, the problem being the software and the hardware. The museum almost went bankrupt. It was so expensive. And the gerbils and their computer environment in what might be seen as an omen or perhaps a simulation we could learn from confused the computer, wrought havoc on the bugs, and end up getting aggressive, violent, and even hurting each other. There's suspicions of perhaps killing each other. No one thought to or could ask whether gerbils wish to live in this computerized environment. No matter, demo or die. Now, literally, the Media Lab motto. Within a few years, Negroponte changes the name of the lab to Media Lab and publishes a new book, Soft Architecture Machines. In this new soft world, the actual computer disappears from sight, the environment itself immersively connected to the user. Negroponte writes this, the new approach was centered on a new structure, the media room, which you see here. This room had quadraphonic sound, seamless floor-to-ceiling displays, probably $2 million of hardware running it. It was an immersive environment, fully networking human sense and computation, perhaps an end of architecture into media. This is another, this pioneer project, and the pioneer project of this media room was, of course, the Aspen movie map. And I turn to it now, as the questions of race, urbanization, war, and society fade into the common embrace of interaction, we're forced to confront what it means to live in this eternally extendable computer-enhanced world. What had started therefore as game theories around military concerns and the simulations of artificial intelligence had now become about total life. Here personalization replaces subjectivization, and individual non-conscious response becomes the focus. So, you know, all these social problems and structural questions are kind of folded into this attention gathering and accumulating environment. As we watch the map slowly unfold, the video enclosing us with historical distance, we can see the idea of a self-organizing system now networked into the attentive system. The environment slowly spirals away into an affective space of preemption. We await the next bend of the road, even as the network remains invisible. The user both highly individuated and simultaneously constantly linked to the networks of machine and media. And this also returns me to Songdo. Is it any surprise the city of pure interface rises up to agglomerate literally nervous attention in the interest of turning it into money, a direct conduit where every interface is only a form of practice to enter a network, not a representation of the world? It also returns me to the art and the small, sad dribbles and their excessively responsive environment. In this case, the logistics of computation had folded upon itself to produce something other, but also radically nihilistic from what was intended. The essential question of my work is how to counter this demo or test bed that has now become our world. The story of Aspen highlights how we need to think of race difference and post-colonialism not merely as representative, but constitutive, of course, of contemporary media infrastructures, and engages us with questions of how to encounter difference, complexity, and chance within digital networks, how to mitigate the relentless and ever-expanding derivation of nervous energy. The question now is what tactics are available in this matrix? How does the productive space between history and preemption get activated to produce a different form of future, not that of the automated derivative, but another form of life? And I'll end on some possible options to this. Thank you.
Yes.
So I have a question about the human and individuality. So it seems like, I've been talking about this with people recently, that it's interesting that fairly recently the idea of people being individuable, you know, not the individual, has taken on a negative tone, whereas maybe 20 years ago this had this liberatory potential, right? Like, oh, you're no longer trapped into being the essentialized person that the system wants you to be. Now you can, you know, be a variety of things. Maybe it's true that you were always sort of a variety of things in these different contexts. And I'm just curious how, so you, sort of all three of you described the emergence of a variety of ways in which people get interpolated as kind of as individuals, but a lot of this is understandable as critique only if you assume that the thing that's really going on or that's better is that people are actually individuals. So I'm just curious if you could reflect on that a little bit.
I think that's an excellent and a wonderful question. I'll probably take a short stab at it, and then maybe others can contribute. The idea of, you're right. We thought that, you know, individuality kind of brought a kind of anti-essentialism, you know, into the picture. Individual was not a static, you know, essential being. But for me, it denotes two different attitudes. I mean, we can think of two different attitudes to contingency, you know, and think of, so the question of identity and identitarian kind of thinking. So we can think of pre-modern sensibility to identity was where contingency was either absorbed or avoided altogether, right? So it was not really recognized that individual was a individual. It was not even recognized. So the person had its place, bound to the place, you know, was clear, the body, all the kind of choreography of an individual played out without sort of contingencies. And with the modern shift, what we have, that the attitude changes where the contingency becomes an invitation to reflect more and recursively process more. So the kind of shelter that the earlier process had, the earlier attitude to contingency had, is kind of no longer available. So some of it is a loss, but as you're right to point out, some of it is a liberation of the same essentialist thinking. Yeah. I don't know what others.
Well, I think it's an excellent question as well, and a lot of what I'm trying to think of as a media theorist, not just a historian, is of course like how do we think media without an observing subject? You know, like this idea is quite difficult. For me, I think one of the questions, I don't actually want to go back to individuality as a virtue. For me, I'm interested in the organization of affects and of those populations. And so the question now for me moves to being, individuation is our condition. It's not a virtue, or I think I want to get away from the moral language period. Like, this is a condition we live in, and I'm interested in the way different practices can create different effects around these methods. So I don't know if that kind of answers anything. And the other thing is, though, but I am really interested also in excavating the fact that population and individuals are not related as they once were. Thinking much more about the fact that clouds, that things that are getting monetized, are not recuperable back into any single subject, both in the way that it works in smart cities, but also if we think about financial systems and financialization and what's happening there. I mean, they're kind of like in the terms of physics. They're systems that don't communicate between one another. They're incommensurable, and so I'm very interested at sort of the opportunities that may offer, and also the problems, of course. So I don't know, but if that helps.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo what they said as well. I mean, good question, and it is something that we have to be careful not to take as a kind of critique in and of itself, right? I mean, as you said, it's our condition, it's descriptive, and then you have to then ask the so what question. Like, what does that mean? I mean, so in Deleuze's postscript on societies of control, he talks about individuals, but then he says this is what that means in this system. It's linked up to the past, whereas it's this kind of identity via synecdoche, basically. And so it's more how that you are a individual, and that little parts of you represent the whole of yourself. What does that mean? And then how do the systems and the logics and the political actors and so on, how do they then use that? And so I think that we're seeing many ways where it's used to our detriment, but I think, as you said, it's our condition. We can't really escape it, so it's more not trying to go back to some kind of enlightenment view of like the total individual, but reshifting the fact that we are individuals and making that more human instead of anti-human.
Thank you. My name is Mark Stallman. I'm the executive director of the Center for the Study of Digital Life at Stevens Institute of Technology across the river. We are going to be a new funding agency for the kind of research that's being discussed here. So I'm here to meet you and look forward to talking to people who'd like to get money from me. I have a question about MIT. As you know, the first footnote in Nick Negroponte's PhD thesis is to a Warren McCulloch paper titled The Ethical Robot. As you showed on the screen, McCulloch's name was on that neural network piece. So my question for you is, have you had a chance yet to explore the work of Warren McCulloch, who is really the character standing behind Nick Negroponte?
Yeah, the answer is, real quick, yes. I was actually going to give a talk on that, but it was longer. I have a book coming out in a month where McCulloch is a really major figure, and actually I talk a lot about the circuit, the neural net, the kind of radical reconfiguration, basically I mean, I assume many people in this room would know about the McCulloch and Pitts neural net, but I look very much at how cybernetic ideas about making the nervous system thinkable in terms of logic gates was a radical reconfiguration, right, of human subjectivity that makes it amenable to computing. But also, it's important to remember that for individuals like McCulloch, and I don't really see Negroponte as quite. McCulloch is working in the realm of the virtual for in the sense of that these machines did not exist. So people were imagining what it would be. And so for them, computers were not technologies that existed, and they were much more dynamic and often exciting than what we describe. So they were kind of envisioning different modes of living, but also different modes of thinking. So to answer your question, I have looked a lot at McCullough, and McCullough's work is really important in understanding these systems because he fundamentally, and Pitts and many other people, I should just give McCullough credit, were very critical in rethinking both cognition. It's very important for them, like machines were not necessarily only these digital silicon-based things. They were machines in your head, machines in your nervous systems. This was the emergence of cognitive and neurosciences as we know them today. So they're very fundamental, I think, in repositioning and producing the type of ideas about perception and about reason that allow us to engage interactively with systems the way we do. So the answer is yes.
Yes.
A question for Aneesh. Aneesh, you're probably aware of the ambitious biometric data project in India, where much of the population that is not included, invisible, is being given a unique identification code. So I'm curious, based on your framing, how do we conceptualize this? Because whether we like it or not, we want to escape from the sort of moral coding of this. It is being used as an instrument to sell it to the state. So here it is empowering citizens, often in rural marginalized areas, to be included. And on the other hand, and this is happening across emerging economies, on the other hand, you have these mobile publics, these undocumented publics, who could be even more marginalized based on these sort of documentation. So I'm wondering how you would include mobility, inclusivity in your sort of discourse of identity.
Yeah, that's just to explain to the audience, I think, what you're talking about. Yes, I have actually done a little bit of research on that. I did spend a year in India, a sabbatical year, a couple of years ago. And I was able, you're referring to UID scheme, unique ID scheme that India rolled out 4 years ago. And it was a it was started by someone called Nanda Nilekani, who was a co-founder of a computer company, Infosys, in India, one of the outsourcing companies that I studied for my first book, Virtual Migration. So the idea is that they have already done about 700 million irises, and double the fingerprints have already been conducted. And it's called Aadhaar card, and people are being issued these unique biometric cards. And it's a kind of authenticity, authentication system. It raises a lot of very interesting questions because it is being kind of developed as an anti-poverty program. And to some degree, actually, it's true, because when I was living in India for a year, my domestic help and maid, and she said, like I said, why do you want this Aadhaar card? And she said, I want it, but because the poor in India do think they are excluded. So the question of inclusion and exclusion by the state, it becomes kind of a Agamben idea that now we have reached a state where we move away from exploitation to regimes of exclusion, in the sense that if you're excluded, then you're left alone like Homo sacer, like a sacred man. If the state abandons you, there are chances that you'd be much worse off, if not exactly killed. So the inclusion of the poor in the Indian state, it brings back some of the state's old, it's a welfare state that wants to give cash transfers to the poor directly, without the middlemen, without the corruption in between. So there's a lot of kind of good thinking, and I interviewed people like Nilekani, etc. And these are kind of, say, my philanthropist people. They really want to do, it seems, at least from the interviews, that they really want to do good. But the question does emerge, this kind of large-scale inclusion, of course, leaves them open to surveillance, leaves them open to discrimination of the various sorts, and the authentication system can be made available to corporations eventually for different kinds of exclusions and inclusions. So it's again quite like the first question, it's a dilemma. Because on the one hand, the only way to be included in the welfare state is by letting your identity be captured by the state. But if you don't do that, then you're worse off than before. So it's again, like this is a condition. It's very hard to pass a judgment on this.
Well, I mean, to go off that as well, the biometric systems, I don't know as much about what they're doing in India, but I know in North America and the UK, biometric technologies are still relatively immature and still really young, but they're being widely implemented. But they're horribly inaccurate, and they don't work a lot of the time, which raises very interesting kind of exclusion and identity issues when if you have 700 million people with biometric UIDs, but maybe 30% of those are misverified or not working, all of a sudden, according to the state, you're somebody who you're not, and so you're excluded in a very different way. And it's very interesting to think about those kinds of things too.
I mean, generally speaking, I mean, one of the things I'm trying to think with a lot of other people in terms of mobility is this kind of new idea of a zonal logic of kind of as a new mode of governmentality, like all these zones, like exception as the rule, which is really actually these major smart cities, which are, by the way, entirely RFID tagged every bridge, and like there's hyper levels of monitoring of movements of who can or cannot enter but this whole idea of this huge emergence of a kind of new global infrastructure of kind of free trade zone, of everything being like exceptionary or exclusionary, it's like is putting forth this idea of a kind of extra statecraft, of like states as like extra crafty in kind of new ways, and also making us rethink about what territory is. And so I don't have any like per se answer, except that it's very clear that also these zones of marginalization also become the kind of zones of state innovation. And so there's sort of this ongoing sort of pressure. And it's precisely these technological foldings, it's like not just with the gerbils, but also with your tags, that actually kind of then create also the impetus for technological penetration. So it's a kind of, it's a very dynamic situation, so
Yeah.
I don't have an easy answer.
Yes.
So what could be, say, a political response, a collective response to these processes you're describing? Because I hear you say, yeah, you don't want to pass any judgment, and I hear you don't want to abstain from moral language. So I get that, but I do think that a different type of response, say a properly political response, is needed. I'm kind of searching in that area, so I was wondering what your ideas are. Because I think that, especially you just mentioned, that really screams for a particular form of politics.
I mean, in some ways, what usually happens with these kind of functional systems that are emerging is that there are specific resistances, as Foucault would say. So specific resistance then so in India, there has been a lot of protest against, especially by academics, of all people, not by the poor, against UID. And even the government now, its leader was against the Aadhaar system, when he was campaigning, and now he's captured power, and he's completely pro-Aadhaar, which I had predicted earlier. Once the state gains a capability, it never lets go of it. So the idea that the guy will become the prime minister and will scrap the whole thing, did not happen. It's not going to happen. Actually, it's extending far beyond the earlier government's jurisdiction. So it's the question then it becomes, it has to be more subtle. And what's interesting with these systems is that you need actually a body of computer scientists that can then go into the architecture, the way, let's say, UID system is being developed, its central repository, what kind of potential issues that could emerge. So this resistance is there, but it has to be a little more specific in terms of the architecture of these environments itself. Especially, and because it's very hard to pass a kind of overall judgment. But one can look at its, like glitches. But the problem with the glitches, bringing out the glitches, is that they'll try to fix it,
right.
And they'll make it even better, right? They say the missiles were not as razor sharp. Then they made it better. Actually, missiles are much more targeted now. So that argument sometimes can,
about relying on some contingent of experts for political action, or is this then is this translatable? Is this scalable? Is this something that involves I can't even imagine like a particular architecture of education, or a big rollout of everybody needs to take computer science classes, et cetera, et cetera. And then still, right, computer science is for, to a large extent, also rationalizes this and it's procedural.
Right.
So it's not only, it also, I think it requires other forms of education as well. Which then, then it rolls out so many new problems I can't even fathom.
But in the West, although in the West there is the groups like Anonymous, or WikiLeaks, or Edward Snowden, very highly computer literate groups that have that are launching a kind of. My student has published a paper on these are kind of information warriors that are launching this war against information asymmetries, because the state, whenever state captures these computing environments. There's asymmetry involved, and it's an economics term. In a transaction, one party, the economics, always assume that there's always a perfect information on both sides of the transaction, the buyer and the seller. But Stiglitz work, people have brought out that one party always knows more. The seller always knows more about the product than the buyer. The landlord knows more about the house than the renter, the fresh renter. So that asymmetry, and so you can see that these. So there is resistance going on in the West already, but in places like India, we don't know. We don't have that group yet.
Just
yes.
really quick on the one thing. I mean, I don't think there is a single solution. It's always situated, contingent, and contested. But I do think, like, in terms of just this question of morality, it's not that I don't have a morality. I actually do think many of these systems are not good. But it's more that I'm wondering whether the way we're framing the problem is delimiting the forms of action we can take. That's the problem. That talking even about cities as smart or dumb is already a normatively, credibly problematic discourse that lends people to only certain types of technophilia or techno-fetishism. And so for me, really, I'm going to stand on difference as actually being a critical component of political action in the sense that we have to have different forms of thought. I'm not going to actually advocate only computer scientists. I actually think that's one of the biggest problems, is that we are excessively dedicated to only one discourse as a solution right now to life on Earth. And that is critical to have an intervention in. And then I'm interested, as many feminist and queer people and other critical race that are actually the genealogies of my thinking. I'm really interested in thinking about different temporalities and different scales of action that can intervene. I'm really interested in intervening just in this discourse, this unassailable belief, so that people can begin thinking about how to inhabit these environments differently. And then I could show you examples, of course, like of different artistic and communal groups and stuff.
In the back there.
Yeah, I just, responding to that last point, I wonder if in our discussions of India, we want to define inclusion and exclusion only through the technical. Because for sure, there are people's groups of various identified and informal organizational capacities that oppose technology as the only solution to inequality. And so in that sense, it's hardly just academics who are against the UID program. I mean, I think that's a kind of shocking statement, quite frankly. So, I mean, and whether or not one's particular domestic worker might benefit from the UID scheme is a whole different issue to, for example, the fact that these types of technologies are used in very different ways across very different unequal peoples in India. So if you think about, for example, what's happening in a huge chunk of India, where there's a Nakshite movement, where there's the whole issue of, it's not just individual surveillance at stake here, right? So I'm just wondering if the measure of inequality is through the technical, what we are missing out in terms of broader political struggles in a country like India, where yes, poor people are not mobilizing against UID because they're mobilizing against much other more pressing material needs, including contesting cash transfers as the only distributive option in terms of state redistribution. So I mean, how can we think about the politics of inclusion and exclusion in the digital realm, but then map it onto more material concerns, I think becomes important.
But see, the language of, that's a very excellent question. The language of inclusion and exclusion itself puts us in that discourse that was started by this new regime. So we are no longer talking about hierarchies as much. We are not talking about, and we are agreeing that being excluded opens you up to various forms of discrimination, exploitation. And so the language itself is part of this new regime that we're talking about, I think. So so the way it envelops, it's very hard to get out of it in some ways. So you either resist it or you find yourself included by it. But there is the idea when actually the Narendra Modi, before he came to power, the idea that he would just stop it all was actually quite liberating. I mean, I thought it's a good idea because it's not well thought out. We don't know what's happening. It hasn't been debated that much. It was suddenly implemented, and within 4 years, because of their ingenuity, they were able to capture so many irises and fingerprints. But the idea then is like, then what? What do we do with it? So I think we were responding to that question. So how do we deal with that situation now?
Well, and to kind of go off that a little bit, I mean, I think that's it's a very interesting question. I think it's right, and it lays out, or it reveals some of the things in there in which, like, it's like a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, right? Like, well, if you want welfare, or if you want welfare benefits, then you're going to need to you just accept the biometric surveillance, the UIDs, whatever other systems they lay on top of it. And so I think we have to try to, as difficult as it is, decouple these things. The welfare ought not to depend upon a biometric UID system. Maybe that's the question we ask. And I think you're right that if the condition of life is such that you just need that welfare, you need that help, then you're going to accept and you're going to take what comes along with it. And we see that in the United States as well. But you also see a lot of resistance to it, but there's a kind of helplessness, right? Like, what do? We need this, but we also just have to accept this, and you have to weigh the benefits. But I think trying to decouple those is an important task.
So I think we should now move on to the next two presenters, and then we'll have more Q&A.
Okay, hi everybody. We have two more presentations in this session. Unfortunately, we have lost our last presenter, Mark Andreyevich, with the drone labor. So it's me and later on Richard. We originally were in a session titled All the Work Without the Worker, and that's actually more what we will be talking about. Okay, this works. My name is Doris Allhutter. I'm a researcher at the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna, and I am a scholar in science and technology studies. Basically, I'm interested in how information systems co-emerge with ideologies and hegemonies in societies and organizations. I'm a lot interested in the effective, discursive and material entanglements of systems and the practices they entail in development and in use contexts. Currently, I'm researching development practices in the field of semantic technologies, and therefore I use concepts of ideology, hegemony, performativity, and agentive materiality. And I think that from a politically engaged STS perspective, it makes sense to try a characterization of such emerging technologies that takes the material discursive conditions of its production into account. So therefore, in this talk, I will sketch out a framework for the analysis of co-emerging computational and economic practices. And this framework tries to grasp the entanglement of capitalist structures with ideologically invested micro practices. I cannot give you an insight into the technical details of semantic computing or of the practices of building a semantic web infrastructure. That is interesting. But I will present some snapshots, at least, that I think are crucial for politicizing this field. The semantic web will lead to an evolution of human knowledge as a whole. Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the internet, has claimed 15 years ago, when he came up with his vision of building an intelligent infrastructure that can also communicate with a variety of other electronic devices. The label semantic web has been a buzzword in the early 2000s, and the visionary promises seem a bit outdated now. They are not quite the revolutionary reconstruction of the web that has been announced, but since then you can see that the field has evolved into diversified areas of semantic computing with a huge variety of subfields that overlap with fields and applications such as linked data, big data, search engines, context-aware devices, and so on. So at this point in time, many technical aspects are of high complexity and yet unsolved. But still, I claim that the practices and bits and pieces that are in place are building a foundation with infrastructural consequences. So let me quickly sketch out what semantic computing is. When designing traditional databases or information infrastructures, so to speak, the web as we used to know it, then meanings of data and relationships between data must be predefined and transformed into data formats and the application code. In contrast, semantic technologies are meaning-centered. They include tools for auto-recognition of topics and concepts, tools for meaning extraction and for categorization. They interconnect data, content, and processes, and in that sense aim at providing more intelligent and responsive interaction. In contrast to classification systems such as simple hierarchically structured taxonomies, semantic technologies are based on ontologies. And an ontology is an explicit specification of a conceptualization that in turn also configures the objects, concepts, and other entities that are assumed to exist in some area of interest and the relationships that hold among them. What you see here on the slide, this window here is Protégé, an ontology editor, and you can see as an example of the you can see an example, maybe you cannot see it because it's too small. Anyway, this is the structure of a medical ontology in this Protégé window here. Protégé has become the leading ontology editor in the past 10 years, and as you can see on the photo, the developers of Protégé have won a 10 years award of the International Semantic Web Community and their conference that has just taken place 3 weeks ago in Italy, actually. An ontology provides a shared vocabulary which can be used to model a domain of interest. That means the type of objects and concepts that exist, their properties and relations. And this shared conceptualization entails the capability to reason about the objects in the domain and the relations between those objects. Objects can, for example, be text, sound, pictures, all of that. And I claim that when we consider the technical pillars and practices surrounding the ongoing configuration of the semantic web, we see that information systems are currently undergoing a paradigm change. And what I want to suggest is that this paradigm change can be characterized or maybe politicized in terms of two entangled characteristics. First, the emerging meaning-centered computational infrastructure is based on the application of ontologies, as I've explained. Apparently, semantic systems emerge with a set of practices that relate different knowledge areas and their socio-political implications to each other. The predicted evolution of human knowledge as a whole, as Berners-Lee announced, relies on the working ontologists, on computer scientists and IT experts that engage in a politics of ordering. And they engage in this ordering in cooperation or in interaction with non-human components such as ontology tools, algorithms, and so on. And I will go deeper into this aspect with an example in a minute. The second important characteristic points to a paradox in the described paradigm change. Quite some of the techniques that are relevant in semantic computing at this point in time actually fall short of the vision of automation and self-learning systems. The scientific semantic web community has discovered that crowdsourcing is useful for the purposes, and they promote that unsolved challenges in semantic computing can be approached by assemblies of scalable, automatic, and high-quality human components. Both practices create phenomena through human, non-human, social-material interactivity, and I use Karen Barat's notion of interactivity here to point out the kind of interaction between discourse and naturality that is at work here. And I want to have a look at some of these phenomena. My first example is on building an ontology, and this is a quote from an interview that I did a while ago with a software engineer in semantic computing. At that time, this software engineer was developing a semantic components of a search engine that was supposed to depict processes of opinion formation in online fora and blogs. The company did that for a government ministry in Austria, and the engineer describes her work practices like this. I should have said, I'll read it and explain later. Hartz IV, and maybe I'll explain immediately. Hartz IV is a labor market policy that was introduced in Germany in 2006, and that meant a massive deterioration of the situation of unemployed people in Germany, and still the effects of this are ongoing. So this was really a severe cut in welfare state politics in Germany. And note that it was an Austrian ministry that had this search engine made for them. So clearly what was going on was that the Austrian government tried to find out about the discourse in Austria about Hartz IV to see if they could get through with that in Austria too. So what does the ontology engineer say? Hartz IV is what we are dealing with right now. Every element has to be assigned an aspect, for example, a political aspect or an economic aspect, so that the user can say he only wants to see the people who have, for example, written about the political aspect of Hartz IV. And if you say you only want to know what people have written on the political aspect of Hartz IV, this means that all documents have to be assigned to different aspects automatically. Then you could see, for example, all main concepts that came up in the forum within the past 2 days: unemployment, welfare, etc. So this is a very vague description of what the programmer's task is, but it points to several important concepts used in semantic computing and also to some of its implementation difficulties. As this quote states, this search engine is based on a definition of what a political aspect or an economic aspect in social media content on Hartz IV is, in particular in written opinion statements of users of blogs. This context-specific ontological definition of political or economic consists of main concepts or a controlled vocabulary, and the function of the search engine is, amongst others, to automatically extract meaning of a statement, to interpret it to be of political or economic nature. As the engineer points out later in the interview, meaning extraction is highly complex, since there is things like irony, sarcasm, dialect, and much more that leads to semantic uncertainty and an openness of interpretation. And this might be even more the case if we think of non-textual web content such as images, video, or speech. But what this example clearly shows is the politics of ordering that is going on here, and that brings forward a hegemonic ecology of knowledge. So the mere fact of trying to separate an economic from a political statement on Hartz IV is ideological per se. The biggest advantage in semantic computing, I recently learned in a technical lecture, is inference. A semantic system creates additional information with inference systems. Inference language allows computers to explain to each other that two terms may seem different or are in some way the same. When inference happens, an ontology can restructure information. The objects of an ontology are rearranged, and that means ontologies are dynamic systems that change their form. In a learning system, the relationality of an ontology's objects and concepts changes also with use practices. And this hints to how human and non-human agencies are entangled here. So we can go on asking, how do such infrastructures interact with society-technology relations, with subjectivities and bodies? We can ask, how do ontologies and their social material implications become agentive for different users? And coming back to the example, we could also ask, how does the historicity of gendered or racialized bodies and of differentially enacted society-technology relations resonate with how the political and the ecological are ontologically specified in the domain of unemployment and precarious living? So this was the first part of the story. So what about the second practice that is used in this field? About 2 or 3 years ago, crowdsourcing has become a relevant topic in semantic computing. The scientific community promotes that unsolved challenges in semantic computing can be solved by, and I quote them, assemblies of scalable, automatic, and high-quality human components. And of course, you know the story. I don't have to explain that to this audience. You know who the scalable human components are that are targeted for doing microtask work. You have the, not very visible here, you have the American mommy, you have people from transition countries, you have platforms that specifically address refugees and third world countries. You have people with disabilities that are addressed here to be this workforce. So whereas the working ontologist is a high-skilled expert or scientist, the high-quality human component are these kind of people, and they might indeed have some knowledge on economic and political aspects of policies like Hartz IV, you can say. So what I want to do now is to give you a bit of background in how the whole issue is discussed and practiced in technical terms. And I have analyzed 2 workshops on crowdsourcing that have taken place at the International Semantic Web Conference 2013 and 14, and the technical papers that have been presented there. And I will rush through this a bit now. So not very surprisingly, presenters in the tutorials base their best practices on ideological ideas like this. It's not always just about the money, right? So management discourses on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and discourses related to the participation culture of the web inspire different genres of crowdsourcing. Here you can see the genres of crowdsourcing. We have merchandise labor, that means workers are paid tiny amounts of money for completing hits, as you know. And then you have fun things like games with a purpose and altruistic crowdsourcing that is done for free by people. These genres are said to be highly complementary. They can be integrated into hybrid genre workflows, which are also referred to as symbiotic combinations of human machine-driven computation, including combinations of different forms of crowdsourcing. So this symbiotic combination of human-machine-driven computation is, for example, symbolized in diagrams like this. Microtask crowdsourcing is increasingly used to augment the results of algorithms solving semantic computing problems, and the crowd is basically a part of the machine, as you can see here. And this is where I want to come back to the first part of the story, to ontology engineering. And I quote from a technical paper that was presented in the workshop 2013. Ontologies are a complex, large, and traditionally, ontologies are complex, large, and traditionally require human curation, making their development an ideal candidate for crowdsourcing. The crowd, in particular, can assist with ontology verification. So workers answer computer-generated questions about ontology axioms. A worker, for example, verifies if a sentence about two concepts that are in a parent-child relationship is correct or incorrect. For example, an ontology that contains the classes heart and organ could bring up the question, is every heart an organ? That would be a kind of microtask that has to be completed here. The crowd performs better on common sense knowledge and somewhat struggles with domain-specific knowledge, like, for example, in the medical domain. But in aggregate, workers can perform on par with experts. So considering these results of the study that has been done here, a plugin has been programmed that integrates crowdsourcing into ontology engineering practices by enabling crowdsourcing from within the Protégé ontology editing environment that I have shown you a while ago. So this is crowdsourcing-enabled ontology engineering. This plugin is set to reduce work times for ontology engineers 11 times. It lowers overall task costs 40 to 80% depending on the crowdsourcing settings, and it leads to data quality comparable with that of tasks performed by ontology engineers. This plugin is the ucomp plugin that you see here. So the ontology engineer specifies a task in Protégé, then sends it to the ucomp plugin. The ucomp plugin creates and launches a crowdsourcing task, and the task is then completed and sent back directly to the Protégé ontology editor. The ucomp platform is a hybrid genre crowdsourcing platform that flexibly allocates the received tasks to games with a purpose or to merchandised labor forms, in particular to Crowdflower. The ucomp interface selects the appropriate crowdsourcing genre and creates the relevant crowd jobs. By default, all created jobs are assigned to level 3 cloud workers in Australia, the UK, and the US, and these workers are assumed to be the contributors delivering the highest quality of work. So they have a high confidence value and accuracy rate. Still, the pay they get is more than micro. You could say it's $0.05 actually. And as I have learned in the crowdsourcing workshop, the reward scheme is not only subject to the question of what is just pay for which class of workers, but you also have to identify the right point that attracts enough good workers but not many spammers. So if you pay more, you get a job done faster, but not necessarily in a better quality. And if you pay a lot more money, you will attract a lot of spammers, and the quality of data will actually go down. So that means the low pay is integral to micro work due to its embeddedness in the information system. Right? That's what the phenomenon that is created here due to the embeddedness in the system. The ucomp platform finally collects and combines crowd work harvested by various genres and provides it then to the plugin, sends it to the ontology engineer, and saves it in the ontology. tasks that can be performed by crowd workers look like this. It's, for example, specification of term relatedness that is used for ontology creation or ontology alignment scenarios. It's verification of relation correctness. It's specification of relation types like equivalence, subsumption, disjointness. And tasks can verify domain relevance. So, for example, the question can be, is a given term relevant for a domain of discourse? Is a concept or class relevant for a domain? And this is, for example, for scenarios where ontologies are extracted using automatic methods, for example, through ontology learning. So the tasks are not easy, as you can see, or maybe not. A question here would be, in the domain of climate change, is class study a subclass of science? So you have to put some thinking into this. Still, $0.05 is rather low pay, you can say. I quote the paper again. From the plugins perspective, the major goal is reducing ontology engineering costs, as crowdsourcing costs will depend on the constraints of the ontology engineer and are hard to generalize. The agreement between the crowd and experts is higher than among experts. This is due to crowdsourcing data being sorted out by majority vote derived from 5 judgments as compared to just one single expert judgment, and that may also raise some questions about the expert's salary in comparison to the worker's salary. So anyway, with this plug-in, crowdsourcing is closely embedded into ontology engineering, and the authors of this paper also expect that the automatic distribution of tasks for parallel processing will make this approach feasible for dealing with large ontologies as well. So here again, the question of scalability. So let me come to my conclusions. The technical infrastructure that is being built for the semantic web relies on an exploitative global division of labor that reconfigures global social relations of production. In this social formation, ontologists of the global north are experts that take part in a restructuring of hegemonic ecologies of knowledge, whereas high-quality human components are conceptualized in terms of cost and time savings, confidence values, accuracy rates. They are part of scalable hybrid systems that are partly automated. So the paradox that shows here is that even though epistemological narratives surrounding semantic computing focus on building automated tools and services based on reasoning with metadata and ontologies, human microwork plays a substantial role in the building of these infrastructures. And we could also look at these infrastructures under the perspective of colonialist exploitation, I guess. This technical infrastructure incorporates knowledge infrastructures that further colonize non-hegemonic ways of knowing. The economic narratives that inform practices of semantic computing are contradictory as well. The crowd is said to work for money, for fun, to reduce boredom, and is also intrinsically motivated by the promises of a participatory culture. At the same time, meaningful work does not need to be compensated for. So it is not work then, but meaning that is harvested through genres like games with a purpose or altruistic crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing cuts costs by undermining labor standards and at the same time is sold to us as a social project that provides earnings to women, refugees, people in transition countries, and people with disabilities. And third, crowdsourcing is a refined form, I would suggest, of a division of mental labor and manual labor that enacts agency differently for engineers and workers taking part on either end of the story. So mental labor is strongly associated with a certain extent of autonomy, while manual work is clearly subject to extreme heteronomy, to an extent where you are automatically eliminated by the system when you do bad work, whatever that is then. something which an expert seems to be free to do due to his or her expert status. I think in my talk I have given you some examples of how computational and economic practices co-emerge, and this leads me of course to the question of power. How can we conceptualize modes of power that are at work here? And I suggest that concepts of ideology, hegemony, agentive materiality help us to understand how social material infrastructures emerge in design processes and work processes that are ideologically embedded, that are materially articulated and also informed by discourse. I suggest to reconsider concepts of ideology, hegemony and performativity, and to see how they can be made productive to grasp various levels and dynamics of how power is reconfigured in economy, society, technology relations, and that it needs an explanatory framework that considers entangled social material agencies as well as macro contexts and also wider social antagonisms, for example, like antagonisms between mental work and manual work. And I don't want to go into more detail here with my last slide. You see, I think that these modes of power that I have noted down here address different aspects, and that we need to think them together in order to get a comprehensive understanding of what is going on here in this field. Thank you.
Our last presenter. Hello, my name is Richard Gilman-Opalsky, and I'm associate professor at the University of Illinois, where I teach politics and philosophy, and I'm happy to be here. 8 years ago, I was defending my PhD dissertation here at the New School, I was only here working I was in the studying here philosophy and politics at the graduate faculty, and I was here for 10 years it took. So I tell colleagues elsewhere that I was on the fast track at the New School, and had many meetings in the Wolf Conference Room, but I could not find the Wolf Conference Room at 65 Fifth Avenue, where it used to be. I want to also just quickly apologize. I feel badly for my co-presenters and also for you. This is quite a marathon. Talk about cognitive labor, extraction of all of your cognitive energies. And I feel badly about that. The papers were great and clearly get short shrift in the number of questions they generate and the limited time to answer them. I'll try to go as fast as possible. There's one quick thing I'll say before getting into it, is that the panel ends at 12:30. This marathon run that we're doing here, you ought to feel free to leave, of course, at 12:30, but I've been told that because there's a lunch break right after this, if people do have questions, I'm not sure, I don't want to speak for my co-panelists, but I'm assuming we might be happy to talk a bit further if time, but they'll tell you if that's not the case. So on the capitalist dream for a world without bodies, digital labor and technontology, I want to discuss the emergence of a new mind-body split in the evolving contexts of cognitive labor. I argue that capital has brought about a peculiar revival of Cartesian dualism at precisely the time when cognitive science and neuropsychology would like to have hammered the final nails into the coffin of the disembodied Geist, the mind, the spirit, the ghost. The conscious energies of workers as well as of students and the unemployed are available for extraction at all wakeful times, while sleep coincides with the time needed to recharge cellular devices. The 8-hour workday has been ended by the inadvertent complicity of people everywhere. We thought we were being given the gift of time, but we ended up giving it all away. The iconic story of the Haymarket Affair and what it meant to everyday people around the world becomes gradually more peculiar as workers shift to the maximal length workday of the wakeful state. From the perspective of capital, the body is an impediment best left behind. New expropriations of brains from bodies move beyond the biopolitical system of brains controlling bodies theorized by Foucault, moving us closer and closer toward a system of disembodied brain activity. Increasingly, the body is relegated to a kind of sensory sexual apparatus that only requires maintenance. And how much maintenance is a very divisive political issue. Who will pay for it? Capitalism has managed to get brain activity to go mobile, to travel freely and fast in real time without the costly mass of the body itself. This disembodiment defines current and dangerous developments in education, work, and social life. Spinoza's famous inquiry about the limits to the power of the body, or what the body can do, I think we have to think on that we've moved now from the question rather of what the body can do to the question of what to do with the body. In 1844, Marx wrote about the alienation of capitalist work with the well-known claim, he is at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he is not at home. Inasmuch as today we are always at work and never at home, we could add a new category of homelessness to the conventional forms, a new kind of foreclosure beyond those that became characteristic of the ongoing crisis in 2010. We need not displace attention to conventional forms of homelessness and foreclosure, but if we fail to consider new dimensions of estrangement and new forms of expropriation, then we fail to understand key features of our society, a society in which an old capitalist dream for a world without bodies is coming more and more to fruition. The fact that work has been increasingly cognitized has been well analyzed by thinkers such as Zygmunt Bauman, Paul Virilio, Bernard Stiegler, and Franco Berardi, among others. Well, perhaps the most systematic and extensive study was carried out by Manuel Castells in his trilogy, The Information Age. In the third volume, Castells defines informationalism, quote, as the material foundation of a new society. Under informationalism, he says, the generation of wealth, the exercise of power, and the creation of cultural codes came to depend on the technological capacity of societies and individuals. This prevailing networking logic, Castells says, transforms all domains of social and economic life. Castells observed how physical labor was increasingly conducted by cognitive means, as the automation of repetitive tasks was more and more organized and overseen by remote computer management. Castells' story seems to confirm Alan Turenn's 1971 thesis of the post-industrial society. However, I think it's really important to stress that the old physicality of many forms of work remains in countless factories and agriculture and construction, sanitation work, throughout the service sector and elsewhere. I think sometimes in discussions of digital labor, the physicality of work gets neglected or it gets lost, and we no longer focus, because we're interested in the new phenomenon or the developing one that we have less of an analytical framework to apply and understanding to, we lose sight of the ongoing physicality of work, of many forms of work. The global division of labor only makes it look like such forms of work have disappeared in certain locations, in the cities of the most highly technological societies, for example. But capital has not liberated itself from production. It has rather hidden the physicality of work by creating as many invisible sites for it as possible, by concealing workers in inconspicuous plants, or by outsourcing whole operations to remote locations. It's important that this point is not obscure, that exhausted and overworked bodies are all over the globe, even in the sprawling warehouses of consumer and tech giants like Amazon. And the problem extends just as well to the unemployed and the underemployed, whose livelihood demands that they demonstrate maximal flexibility and availability and maximal speed and responsiveness to compete for work. In fact, the unemployed may well be more preoccupied with the irreducibly bodily concerns of capital and work than those who have a steady job and income. So, I am by no means, in thinking about the capitalist dream for a world without bodies, suggesting that bodies have been eliminated. But here is the point, that wherever the old physicality of work remains, it is increasingly viewed as a problem to be solved. Capital looks upon the body as an unfortunate obligation, an obstacle. The human body is not only costly in the obvious ways of health benefits and expense reports, but is also susceptible to injury, sickness, exhaustion, and capable of protest and strikes, which typically exercise their power through bodies. Jean Baudrillard understood this well in his assessment of the comportment of capital to the body in an interview published in the book Paroxysm. He says, quoting, "Nowadays, someone who works is pretty much a corpse they can't manage to get rid of. The system would like to get rid of it, but it can't quite manage the trick, and the workers don't want to lose their raison d'etre." While capital has still not managed the trick of getting rid of the body, it has made major advances in that direction, and it now appears less like a magic trick than a practical question of how far and how soon the body can be gotten rid of. Meanwhile, natural and cognitive scientists have been reinforcing the non-existence of any mind-body split, defending the premise, now old and familiar, that mind is matter, that the human brain is entirely bodily, overlooking capitalist progress in working out a reversal that they have missed, a functional separation of the mind and the body. So when Daniel Dennett wrote that book with the most audacious title, Consciousness Explained, he set out to give us consciousness in purely materialist terms, to consider the philosophical implications of a purely materialist understanding of consciousness, but any explanation of consciousness that ignores consciousness in the context of political economic dimensions of life, I think, is deeply problematic, to say the least. To be clear, this doesn't refute the empirical claims. I don't mean to refute the empirical claims of cognitive science. Brain function is indeed bodily, but from the perspective of capital, it's a problem. Why must the whole body be carried around just to bring its brain activity to some one place or another? Like at this conference, there is, I understand, a part of the conference today, which is a Skype. Yeah, this is part of it. Yeah, but there's also others elsewhere who are joining the conference without their bodies. And in a certain sense, it's difficult to justify bringing the body along to a conference. I mean, really, what I'm here to do is to present this paper, which I could easily have done while leaving my body in Illinois. I like my body to come along with the presentation. There's something about the embodied experience of being in New York again, of being nervous, of worrying about the time and everything else, and seeing you and getting more tired every minute. And that is a part of the process. Now, online education too. I'm on a campus, I think this was just beginning at the New School when I was here, where there is a very strong discourse which is almost unanimously endorsed by liberals and whoever else across the university system, that the body is essentially irrelevant to education. And so we have all of these different initiatives which make sense when looking at enrollments and revenues to conduct the whole educational project without human bodies. So disembodied education, all that is needed is content and a gathering of brains, a conference of brains, brains without bodies. The body is really, in a lot of ways, too much trouble, isn't it? It has to be carried from place to place. It has to be fed. If I could have done the presentation from Illinois, think about the money I wouldn't be asking the dean for. You know, there's a lot of capital involved in taking this big body around everywhere, feeding it too, paid for in its movement on planes and trains and inside of costly cars, all of which are way too slow now. The body needs a place to sleep. It requires space. It gets tired before the brain is done thinking. That often is the experience at a conference, isn't it? So it's actually maybe the reverse. With technological assistance, capital is always more aggressively, but now more successfully than ever, attempting to overcome a problem so sharply observed by Eric Hobsbawm when he wrote in The Age of Extremes, "Human beings are not efficiently designed for a capitalist system of production." And yet we must consider the problem ontologically, because for me, it's less interesting to talk about technology per se, but about the relationship of technology to being in the world. More important than technology, or maybe why we have enduring interests in technology at a conference such as this, is to think about lasting transformations in intersubjectivity, communication, association, self-understanding, and the evolving cultures of work and society. This is a question of what could be called rather technontology than technology. At a certain stage of technological development, it is both undesirable and impossible to opt out of the new relationality. As some of you may have seen, the October 2014 issue of The Economist last month featured a long special report on the world economy entitled "The Third Great Wave." This is the October 4th Economist. It was a 14-page report that accuses the digital revolution of the late 20th century, the language in The Economist, of opening a great divide between the wealthy few and the rest of society, of, quote, keeping wages flat for the mass of workers, and, quote, of making automation the preference of business to hiring underemployed workers around the world. In short, The Economist's breaking long feature accuses the present tech economy of what capitalism has been doing for well over 200 years, since long before the so-called digital revolution. Because of its free market pathologies, which always appear at the terminal stage, The Economist is not capable of an analysis that locates these tendencies in the logic of capital, or capitalism itself. So I want to talk about three things that I think are tendencies in talking about digital labor, talking about technology, and talking about transformations in work and everyday life that I would suggest are all problematic in their own ways. I think we need to criticize and to dispense with discourses on digital labor that ignore how the logic of capital remains a central organizational logic of work and everyday life, even when the operational mode of work and life changes. This is something that I think I could see in Doris's paper, and also in some other aspects, maybe of Orit's as well, that there is, that if you want to explain, for example, some of these developments, you have to look at how the logic of capital organizes and incentivizes these transformations of work. And I'm not accusing any of you of this. I think actually it's not something I saw here on the panel today, but I do think that sometimes when the operational mode of capital changes, we think that capital is no longer a question. And I think that's a mistake. I think we have to look at how the organizational logic is not the same thing as the operational mode. But saying that does not mean that we should accept some narrow, economistic, Marxist analysis in some old, much of what I'm saying is, I suppose, quite old-fashioned. I'm talking about capital and class. And I don't have a PowerPoint and all the rest, but I actually got that from the graduate faculty. I don't know how to use it. But I was never taught. But positions in Marxist milieus that never see anything significantly new in the capitalist life world, I think, guarantee bad analysis of what's going on. That we really need to criticize and dispense with conventional Marxist, with those positions in conventional Marxist milieus that always want to say it's the exact same thing and nothing has changed. Finally, we need to, I think, criticize and dispense with analyses and discourses that seek only to see liberatory politics and technological pathways. So that is to say, the purportedly more radical line that wants to emphasize the emancipatory side of technology. I think this approach is too quick to imagine flight from the body as a kind of liberation. Against a world without bodies, I would insist on a reversal of perspective, which recasts Spinoza's framing to defend what bodies in the world can do. And there are concrete ways to do this in education. I think we should think about this is not something I have done, and as far as I know, it is being done now, research that looks at the qualitative differences between embodied and disembodied education. The values of real-time improvisation, gestural and bodily engagements, how much these things actually do matter and perhaps ought to be defended. In work, in politics, and in friendship as well, I think we should focus on the ongoing importance of the body. We should remember that the same capitalists who want to abandon our bodies want for themselves top-tier healthcare and to fly first class. So on the question of the body, everything for certain bodies. But elsewhere, the body is irrelevant. If we forget our bodies while working together in metatopical spaces, then I think we give too much over to capital, which has already taken too much. Thanks.
In what you were saying about capitalism not needing bodies, and I was about to say you missed something really important, but then you mentioned that capitalism, everything for certain bodies, right there at the end.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to draw attention to that fact that it's important to think about how there's this disembodiment that's sought by capitalism, but then there's also this incredible economy of the body become image that's being circulated and glammed up, worked on, beyond real body that is also essential to some functionings of capitalism. So, and that body that's glammed up and fashionable actually depends on these other, not irrelevant, refuse, bodies as refuse that we don't care as long as they can make the things that make the essential body for the functioning of capitalism. So I just wanted to add that into the discussion. That I don't think you were focusing on that, but I think it's an important element of what you were saying.
And also the body in relation to the pharmaceutical industry. Body is important, right?
That's a very good point.
Yes.
I was recently working with an Australian woman, Marilyn Emery, wife of Fred Emery, both very important in the history of an organization called the Tavistock Institute. It's part of a larger group of people, of which Warren McCulloch was an important piece, typically called systems thinking. But in particular, this was the participatory democracy for workers component. So Fred Emery did a lot of work in Norway and Japan. My question is, have you as you're thinking about these participatory activities, have you been interested in drawing relationships to all of this older body of work, social engineering efforts to be sure, in which participatory democracy is being used, and Maryland's technique is called a search conference. There's a lot of literature about this. I was wondering if you'd come across it.
Actually, no. My focus really is working with ontology engineers, and so to speak, through this conference, I've only become aware of the other side of the human components that are not talked about usually, right? So that participatory culture has not yet been a big issue in how I look at semantic computing. But I should for sure have a look at that, yeah. Thank you.
Yes, back there.
So I did my PhD in postdoc in neural nets, deep learning, all this. And so one of the dreams of AI is not just to get rid of the body, but also to eliminate the need for the mind, cognitive labor, and everything like that. So like, in addition to, you know, basically turning like Amazon workers in the factory into basically robots, right? Even like the dream of the, you know, people in the AI world was to even obviate the need for programmers, scientists, all of that, right? So like IBM is trying to, you know, create systems that can diagnose medical conditions, whatever. You might end up replacing the need for doctors, nurses, whatever. So I was wondering if you've thought also about, you know, where that leads us, what kind of world, you know, we're looking at if we obviate the need for, you know, thinkers, cognitive labor, the creative class.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question, and I suppose what I think here is that there are a lot of different motivations for these developments, and that people, for example, interested in AI at Tufts University aren't necessarily looking at research and development in that area from the perspective, what I call the perspective of capital, right? They may be thinking of it in other terms. One of the tendencies that I think we can see in the context of digital labor and work specifically, and how work has changed, and actually some of the things that have been better introduced by my colleagues on this panel, is that it's a problem of power. So, you know, I accept enough of the Marxian approach to thinking about, you know, power and economy and the interests of profit and all the rest to see that unless we can somehow steer these developments in, maybe you might say, a more participatory way, that, you know, and that I'm a bit suspicious of that as a possibility. They are seized upon and developed for other purposes, quite contrary to the better ones we might imagine. And this is part of the reason why I wanted to insist today on the ongoing, on some kind of an ongoing, enduring interest in how the logic of capital determines the developments of these different frontiers, how these things go.
Maybe it would be interesting to have a conversation between these papers, because in some sense they're dialectically opposite, which is good. So there's an argument going on that it's not that things have become disembodied, it's that everything has become embodied. A reverse discussion about digital media that thinks of the digital very expansively, but also, somebody already mentioned pharmaceuticals. I mean, the body has never been more productive and more incorporated more regularly into machine systems. And that's very material. So in some sense, I saw Doris giving a talk where what had once been a dream of AI has been overcome through basically materializing a human machine. Like, instead of trying to do it through symbolic processing, basically the new labor organization just harnesses basically human workers with their bodies to incorporate it into a kind of biomimetic network for, cognition, if you will. And I take seriously that materiality, and I was wondering if there's not a way to change this discourse, and then to change this discourse away from the question of body and mind, which kind of has a long and problematic history in Western and other forms of colonial, to questions of precarity, and whether it's not a question of embodiment or not, and that it's very material. An algorithm is material; it does work in the world. But whether we're talking about, maybe there are other ways we can voice this, the organization of capital and its force on technology differently, away from that and towards, I think, what you're gesturing at, which is actually trying to understand a kind of if you're taking from Karen Barat, the kind of materiality of these relations and their kind of emergent features.
Yeah, I guess also if you think it from an affect theoretical perspective, right, you could say that the logics of capitalism actually work through the body, in the sense that it is the location or the materiality or the practice through which capitalism actually gains effective power.
So I would just say quickly, I actually agree with both of these points, and perhaps it's a problem in the presentation. As it turns out, I like what you say, Orit, about precarity. These are 3 pages from a book my book called Precarious Communism, which was published in March. And so it's the whole book is about precarity and very little about this mind-body thing. This was more a question of what can I do here? So there are a few pages I took. But actually on this thing about production, I think the interesting question for me is that on the bodies, when you say that bodies have never been more productive, I mean, this I think just is, it's not non-controversially, but I think it's quite easy to demonstrate the truth of this. I mean, we can look at very basic measures of productivity and all the rest and show it, as others who do this kind of thing have shown. But it's a question of does the level of productivity through and by human bodies correspond to the valuation of the body? And so actually what I want to observe rather, which I think is consistent with this crowdfunding, these forms of labor, and also actually Jathan, right?
Right.
Jathan actually with that the translation program. This is an enormously productive and embodied activity, but at the same time, it does not correspond in any way to the valuation of the body, which is going down. So I think this is one of the problems precisely that I would want to bring some of this, some Marxist analytics to highlight that where bodily production goes up, the devaluation of the body may well just plummet.
I think one last question and we'll end the session.
And I very much appreciated your talk. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about capital's need for the body to consume. And it's really as a consumer where we actually gain value, and where, you see even as unions become more precarious in their existence, you get consumer movements that are, have a lot of energy and are moving forward. And algorithms don't wear pants. And so there is a, there is leverage there for human beings as consumers, and just wanted to get your thoughts on that, because a lot of what you were talking about seems like the irrelevance of humans to capital, but.
Yes, I mean, I think it's not the irrelevance of humans. It's some cost-benefit analysis of what is necessary from the human for capital, and so consumption is a very good place to look at this. I think, obviously, we need to, as you say, be active consumers, and that that capital needs us to be constantly investing into into consumption. But notice that one of the things that's become precarious, more and more precarious in recent years, is the actual store. And there was a way in which, like, the Barnes and Noble, which was vilified maybe 10, 15 years ago for shuttering all of these independent shops, is now is now in the position where one might want to actually defend them. Now the Barnes and Nobles are closing down by the hundreds because consumption doesn't need those buildings. It's a different form of consumption, which of course assumes, I think all of what I'm saying about the disembodied brain assumes bodies somewhere down the line. There's always a body there. And this is why I want to insist that the empirical, I'm not making up an empirical argument against the basic materiality of the mind and the body, but that we almost are in a position now where we would want to defend the old villains because they're disappearing, and we know consumption is not even a space anymore where bodies need to come together. I mean, that's one of the problems with consumption, and what's happening now next week is that Black Friday and Cyber Monday, and faced with the option, one of the preferences for the we might say more disembodied form of consumption is that the body is a real pain in the ass, because there's a lot of other bodies there trying to shop, and we can do it if we can shop, even if at the end it's for the body. It would be better to shop without the body. So consumption, I think, is also working out some interesting and problematic in also just economic terms, in terms of cities, city planning. I mean, there's a whole sort of architectural city planning dimensions of this, which I think in some ways are harder to see in a city like this. Whenever I come back, I think that it's kind of hard sometimes to notice in a city like Manhattan. You would have to be told that there was an economic crisis, because the circulation of capital it's not perceptibly different. But where I live, you can see these things very clearly, and of course they can be measured, as well. So.
With that note on various mediations of the body, thank you very much.